is W5. An essential resource under threat, exposed to a foreign species.
Next 5-10 years, we're not gonna have a damn salmon.
And infected with a deadly pathogen.
They're just lying on the surface and the birds are picking them up.
W5 investigates the impact of industrial fish farming.
Are your farms killing off the wild salmon?
And one woman's 30-year battle to stop the spread of disease.
Something bad is going on with those fish.
And save a species before it's too late.
I forecast extinction of wild salmon on this coast.
And a lucrative, brutal billion-dollar sport. And the talented newcomer who wants a piece.
At the end of the day, it's a business.
And after years of hard work, he's taking his shot.
I believe that I have the potential to be the best ever.
Kevin Newman, in the ring with a champion, a humble Canadian with hometown pride.
There's no quit in this house.
Taking control of his career.
To change the game of boxing, to change how things are done.
And taking on the world of boxing his way.
I have a whole country behind me that they'll follow me right into war.
Here is Kevin Newman.
Hello, and thanks for joining us. It is the biggest disappearance case on Canada's Pacific coast. The experts predicted 4 million salmon would spawn in the Fraser River this year, but only 1.5 million showed up. Now, there are a lot of theories as to why that happened. Climate change, predators, maybe. But there's one claim which cannot be ignored, that the reduction in the wild salmon population coincides with the introduction of the industrial farming of Atlantic salmon in British Columbia. CTV's Peter Akman investigates what might be behind a vanishing act.
Dip just beneath the surface of the Pacific Ocean, off the northeast coast of Vancouver Island, the ecosystem in those black and green waters is in turmoil. Wild Pacific salmon are dying off, and you may be looking at the cause. These are farmed Atlantic salmon, a different species, raised in pens by the millions, whose very existence may be changing these waters forever. Now the ship, sporting the skull and crossbones, is sailing into direct confrontation with a $700 million a year industry.
Mark, can you plot a course for Cleo Channel, the grape farms?
Yeah, sure.
The Martin Sheen, yes, it's named after the actor, belongs to the Sea Shepherd Conservation Society, who are known for extreme environmental battles.
The fog's really heavy, so they'll need to keep an eye on it.
But this voyage, they claim, is for research. On board biologist Alexandra Morton, who spent the past 30 years trying to get rid of fish farms along the BC coast.
It's painful in this day and age to be a biologist and watch the world around you be destroyed, be unraveled, be unplugged.
But it hurts you when you see this happening.
Yeah, I love this place. I raised 2 children here, and they cannot come into the place I love, where I live, and just wreck it without me doing everything I can to stop that.
Morton has already decided what's wiping out the wild Pacific salmon. She blames it on those farmed Atlantic salmon and the industry's disregard for the delicate environment.
Wild salmon are so generous. You know, they feed the trees that make the oxygen we breathe. They feed the orca, they feed birds, they feed us. They fed this whole culture that's here.
And so aboard the Martin Sheen, she and the crew spent 6 weeks cruising the bays and inlets along the BC coast, investigating and documenting one fish farm after another. The farms are massive floating facilities, each home to up to 750,000 Atlantic salmon raised just behind this netting. Morton and the environmentalists insist the farm salmon are rife with disease and sea lice, easily transferred to wild salmon on the other side of the nets. And so they motor over and climb aboard to obtain samples and underwater images in defiance of the fish farm owners. Dozens of inspections seeking examples of sick and and deformed farm fish, proof of the risk they believe this invasive species poses. Back at her lab in Echo Bay, Morton has been studying farm salmon samples from these kinds of visits for years. Her conclusion?
My concern is that salmon farms are killing off wild salmon because they amplify disease. And so wild salmon are now, as they try to migrate through this coast, they are exposed to far higher levels of pathogens than they ever were throughout their whole evolution.
How can you put it all on the farm salmon?
The thousands of juvenile salmon I look at every single year since 2001 as they go to sea. And you see them when they come out of the river. They're beautiful. They're incredibly beautiful. They're iridescent silvers and blue, and they're just fat and sassy little fish. And then they go by the farm, they get a few lice. And by the time they get 10 kilometers down the way, there's a bay, I just call it the Bay of the Damned, because by then they have so many holes in their body, physical holes that you can see, that they're wasting away and they're just lying on the surface and the birds are picking them up.
Besides the sea lice, there are diseases that infect salmon, all with simple acronyms. Farmed and wild are at risk. The mortality rate on these farms is 10%. Morton herself doesn't go on salmon farms anymore. She's already been charged with trespassing once. So she's teamed up with First Nation chiefs like Willie Moon, who claim these massive farms are killing a traditional food source. And they rely on the fact that they've never ceded this territory to justify their actions. On this visit, they try to block farm operators as they restock the pens with thousands of baby fish known as smolts.
I saw you guys walk away pretty frustrated.
We've never said okay to them to come into our territory to put these fish farms. The last year, I believe we lost, I think, between 40 and 60% of our smolts. I mean, if this continues, I figure in the next 5-10 years, we're not going to have a damn salmon to be catching in our waters.
Another farm they've been concerned about is this one, called Newline. During their first visit, they watched the staff scramble to collect dead fish using nets. Now on a second visit, Chief George Quacksister wants to get a closer look by boarding the farm.
Chief George is wearing multiple GoPro cameras. He's going to dock with the fish farm here, and he's going to lower down a GoPro on a long pole to see exactly what's going on with these fish inside the pen.
So I'm to inform you that this is an unauthorized visit to the site.
You're not going to say I'm trespassing?
Well, you know you're trespassing, George.
You know your boss is trespassing. What's that fish there? What's up with that? Sick. Look at this guy. What's up with that? Look at this fish. That's not good, is it?
I don't believe that they are sick fish, and I don't believe that
With
the
the-
science
with-
says
with
that
the-
they are sick
look
fish,
at that,
George.
none of balls.
At this point, you know, I've been asked by the company not to engage with any protesters.
Look at that. You can't tell me that's healthy fish.
So, George, did you see anything that surprised you in there?
It's every pen in these channels anyway, you know what I mean? Every pen I've been to, they're diseased, sick fish.
On this day, they lucked out, finding the remains of a farmed Atlantic salmon. A perfect and fresh sample, direct from the farm that Morton will test for diseases.
Right, Alex, what did you find?
So this is the guts of an Atlantic salmon,
Yeah.
but the liver's here, the gallbladder, the gills, and the spleen, which is puffy, which is not a good sign. It's a sign of poor health, fighting infection.
Morton is convinced that this is just one example of infection in farmed salmon that can kill off wild salmon.
The dangerous thing about salmon farms is not only do they crowd the animals together and thus cause these explosions of viruses, bacteria, and parasites, but they're open to the ocean with these nets and everything washes out. I mean, a particle in this waters here can travel 10 kilometers in 6 hours. So they're having this huge release of pathogens. And while their fish are drugged and only have to live 18 to 24 months before they're bonked on the head and sent to market, the wild fish outside the pens have to be supreme athletes every single day of their life to escape predators and to catch food and then to eventually swim up a waterfall to spawn.
To understand the extent of the impact of these farms, we decided to go and look underwater for ourselves. Staying on the outside of the farm nets, it's clear the salmon aren't the only ones being fed at these farms. Wild fish swarm the area, living in the cloudy waters. Now, it was clear when you got down there. There are tons of wild fish feeding on whatever they're feeding these salmon. There's also fecal matter. Thick, thick, thick. You can barely see 3 or 4 feet in front of you. You could see just large pieces of feces just floating right by you. It's amazing the impact.
Have you found direct evidence that those diseases, those pathogens, can be transmitted to the wild salmon? Is there direct proof?
So the word direct proof is a scientific term that's very hard to prove. So what we have instead is the weight of evidence.
And the weight of evidence Morton relies on is found here in Campbell River. Steve Ordana has been a salmon fisherman for 4 decades.
And what's this year been like?
Pretty much non-existent. It's been like the bleakest ever that I've heard of. I never even bothered.
Have you ever taken a summer off?
Not really, no. I've never had a season that I didn't fish sockeye in 40 years, except for this one.
To make a living, Ordana is now fishing halibut, just hoping next season the salmon will come back. But Alexandra Morton has her doubts.
How do they explain that the Fraser River sockeye began declining in 1992, exactly when they put their farms on their migration route? This is not an ebb and flow situation. This is the path to extinction that these fish are on right now.
Massive fish farms in troubled waters.
It's not natural, we don't believe in it.
But who's protecting the wild salmon?
Frankly, we understand the public concern.
When W5 continues.
Early morning sailing the waters of the Broughton Archipelago up the BC coast. The drums of protest aren't the only sounds disturbing the silence. The distinct rattle of automatic feeders can be heard through the mist long before you see the massive salmon farm, just one of dozens in these waters. The drums signal that this farm is under occupation. Chief Ernest Alfred has been living here for more than a week to draw attention to the decline in wild salmon.
We've told them 30 years, don't have these pens, don't grow your fish here. It's not natural, we don't believe in it. Please remove them, and they've not listened.
When you look over into those pens, what do you see in those fish?
When I see what's going on here, I see a direct conflict with the wild species. And of course, these guys don't worry about our wild fish. It's just a farce.
Fish farming of Atlantic salmon here on the Pacific coast is big business and sanctioned by the BC and federal governments. Despite their protests day after day, this massive supply freighter arrives loaded with baby Atlantic salmon, the next crop that will spend 2 years growing in these Pacific waters. At its stern, a Norwegian flag. This farm and nearly half of those like it in BC are owned by a company called Marine Harvest, the global fish company, Norwegian-owned.
Marine Harvest Canada is the largest aquaculture company in British Columbia, with over 500 employees dedicated to raising sustainable salmon.
The company's promotional videos promote an image of natural bounty, produced while coexisting with wildlife, and of course providing millions of tasty meals from salmon farms like this one on the BC coast.
This is where we store the feed as well. It's delivered here every 2 weeks.
Marine Harvest's Canadian spokesperson Ian Roberts insists the industry is not harming wild salmon.
We grow fish very responsibly, and we do that very well in British Columbia.
We see a farm here, and we see a farm there, and another one here, and another one in this area. Do people have reason to be concerned?
I think if people understand why aquaculture was developed, that is responding to a growth in demand for seafood, but our ocean's not able to produce more, they would understand that it has its purpose here.
To prove it, Roberts took W5 on a tour.
So what you're seeing here is a pretty typical farm. You've got 10 cages total, with about 60,000 fish in each cage.
So what type of meat numbers are you harvesting per year just in one 10-pen place like this?
Yeah, this farm, after we're done processing, we'll have about 3,000 tons of fish meat, of salmon, ready for the market.
So, salmon for everyone. And the only thing to worry about, they claim, takes care of itself.
The fish poop.
Yes, fish poop in the ocean. And directly below this farm, there will be an impact from that fish poop. But the ocean has a remarkable way of cleaning itself.
The amount of vocal groups that are speaking out against these farms, saying the impact that they have, the detriment to the wildlife around it. How does that balance in your mind?
I think every business needs their critics. I would just hope that those critics and the discussion around our business is one based on fact and science, and not just opinion and belief.
But science runs smack into this.
These are videos that were provided to us from
images collected by their longtime adversary, Alexandra Morton, and her allies with the Sea Shepherd Society.
The public, they see those pictures, right? They see the fish and the eaten away faces. Is that fear-mongering tactics?
I can tell you this, that we have people that look critically at our business here in British Columbia. Every business should.
Crux of this whole thing is, are your farms killing off the wild salmon?
No. And that's not just my opinion, that's fact and that's science.
But whose science? Roberts showed us how they regularly check their farm salmon for disease and pests.
So every week we grab fish just to do a general health check. We'll be checking the exterior for sea lice, which is naturally occurring in the ocean. We'll also check for gill health and mucus layer, and just an overall check.
And with an average 10% mortality rate, it's information they're required to report. All, of course, to ensure healthy farmed salmon. And lately, they've been tracking a new bug, Piscine Rio virus, or PRV, which is believed to cause the deadly salmon disease HSMI. It's gutted salmon farms in Norway, where it was first spotted. Here at the Department of Fisheries Laboratory in Nanaimo, scientists first confirmed that HSMI, responsible for the Norwegian outbreak, was now in BC.
Purples are all the inflammatory lesions.
Christy Miller is the lead researcher.
What would an outbreak of HSMI mean to the farm industry?
Well, in Norway, the HSMI is so prevalent right now. In the beginning, it was just a nuisance, but the average, I'm told from people who work on it there, is around 7 or 8% mortality. There's the odd time that they've observed up to 35%.
That's in farm salmon, dying off due to infection that weakens their heart muscles. But the virus has also been found in wild BC salmon, and that worries Miller.
I've never seen a heart with that much virus in it. For a farm fish, you know, it's an issue for production, but the issue is if that kind of disease were in wild fish, they don't have that same ability to recover, because if they're emaciated and slow, they're going to be eaten by a predator.
Miller's recent discovery has called into question the entire regulatory process, because as far back as 2008, farm salmon samples containing HSMI and PRV have been submitted to the government, but they never made it to DFO labs, because the job of testing salmon is that of the BC government, and it didn't raise any alarms.
BC's lead scientist, Gary Marty, first spotted the disease.
Have you found HSMI in farm fish?
Well, the first time I reported abnormalities in the heart that looked like HSMI was in 2008. When I talk to our veterinarians, they tell me that we don't have the serious clinical disease that they have in Norway. And so we don't use the term HSMI like they do in Norway. We prefer a more general term. To the public, it'd just be a heart disease of unknown cause.
But those veterinarians he's talking about actually work for the fish farms, and their relationship goes further. Documents obtained by W5 reveal that Gary Marty was also working with Marine Harvest, co-authoring these scientific papers supporting the company's position that there was no HSMI on its BC farms.
Critics of these aquaculture farms in water, they say that that relationship is maybe too cozy.
If we have a good relationship with our industry, if they trust us, they will provide us with samples of dead fish. Because every farmer understands, they don't want a serious disease.
He has a relationship with Marine Harvest.
He has a relationship with the industry, and he also is, the person doing the pathology associated with the regulatory programs. And it is, even if it isn't a conflict of interest, it certainly has the appearance of one.
For Alexandra Morton, it calls into question who's really protecting wild salmon.
Got one scientist, Dr. Christy Miller. She gets access to one generation of farm salmon, and she finds heart and skeletal muscle inflammation right away. But Marine Harvest and Gary Marty have had access to these fish for years and years in many, many farms, and they say that they can't find it. I began writing to Gary Marty and saying, okay, Gary, what is it? Did you find it or didn't you find it? And so what he said was, yeah, I found it. But I went to the fish farmers. Fish farmers apparently said, no, our fish are fine.
And the minister and DFO has access to all of this.
Yeah. The Fisheries and Oceans Canada has become all about the salmon inside the pens. The Minister of Fisheries, Dominique LeBlanc, how can he allow a virus we know causes disease to just pour into these waters?
How are you?
Dominic LeBlanc agreed to an interview with W5 during a visit to Vancouver.
Do you see a problem with these open water farms?
We're doing a risk assessment right now on the issue of disease transfer. That's a source of huge concern for British Columbians, for our government.
But in the meantime, the numbers are dropping.
We're not going to let the wild salmon disappear. And as I said, we're going to take the management measures necessary to ensure the recovery and the health of the wild salmon stocks.
Now, there's been a lot of criticism of the science, and there's a lot of criticism that the BC scientists are too cozy with, say, Marine Harvest. How do you square that for the public who thinks maybe there's an inside job going on?
Well, obviously, we wouldn't tolerate an inside job or any notion that the science is compromised.
The man at the heart of the science controversy, he believes there should be more fish farms.
Would you support the expansion of open water farms?
I think it can be done sustainably. Certainly the numbers we see right now, I think could support some incremental growth in the industry.
Are you willing to stop expansion until you actually have the science?
We're not going to approve any new sites for salmon farms until public confidence can be improved, until we have the necessary scientific advice that would justify that.
But Alexandra Morton worries that people are already writing off the wild salmon.
Well, people are so used to hearing salmon are going extinct, they've gone numb to it. It's really unresolved whether we will wake up in time.
While there is certainly controversy, there is no health reason to avoid farm salmon. Most of the experts agree it is completely safe to eat. Here's what's straight ahead.
Determined at an early age.
I started seeing the passion that he had.
To stay humble, focused, and strong.
I'm just an aggressive, scrappy young fighter that has a lot of heart.
When W5 continues.